I stood in what used to be my kitchen, staring at the eviction notice in my trembling hands, while my husband David packed his belongings upstairs as if nothing had changed. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 3 years of marriage, I was being kicked out of the house I'd helped buy, renovate, and turn into a home, all because 6 months ago, David had quietly transferred the deed into his mother's name for tax purposes. What he hadn't expected was that his beloved mother would be the one holding that same eviction notice, her face twisted with disgust as she looked at her son like he was something she'd scraped off her shoe. "You have 48 hours," Eleanor Winters had said just an hour earlier, her voice cold as winter steel. "Both of you. I won't have a cheater and his accomplice living under my roof." But here's what neither David nor his manipulative family knew. I wasn't the accomplice. I was the victim who'd just become the executioner. The sound of David's footsteps on the stairs made my stomach churn. He appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger, and what I now recognized as barely contained panic. "Emma, we need to talk about this situation with my mother. She's being completely unreasonable." I almost laughed. Even now, caught red-handed in the most spectacular way possible, he was trying to manipulate the narrative. Unreasonable? Your mother just found out her son is a lying, cheating fraud, and you think she's being unreasonable? Look, what happened with Sarah was a mistake, but it's over. Mom doesn't need to know every detail of our private life. His voice carried that familiar, patronizing tone that had slowly chipped away at my self-worth over the years. If you hadn't gone crying to her with your dramatic photos and voice recordings? Dramatic? The word came out as a whisper, but it carried the weight of 3 years of gaslighting, manipulation, and betrayal. You called your affair partner from our bedroom and told her you were going to divorce me once you figured out how to keep the house. You said I was too stupid to realize what you'd done with the deed. You laughed about how easy it was to convince me to sign those papers. David's face went pale. He hadn't realized I'd been recording our conversations for weeks, gathering evidence of his plans to leave me homeless and penniless. But then again, David had always underestimated me. They all had. What none of them knew was that I'd been preparing for this moment longer than they could possibly imagine. You see, this wasn't my first life, or rather, it wasn't my first time living through this betrayal. 3 months ago, I died in a car accident after discovering David's affair, heartbroken and penniless, having lost everything to his scheme. But somehow, impossibly, I'd woken up in my bed 6 months earlier with every memory intact and a second chance to rewrite the ending of this story. The first time around, I'd been blindsided. This time, I was ready for war. 3 years earlier, I should have known something was wrong from the beginning. But love makes you willfully blind to red flags that seem obvious in hindsight. I was 24 when I met David at my cousin's wedding, still reeling from my parents' sudden deaths in a plane crash 6 months before. I was alone in the world except for my inheritance, a modest trust fund that my parents had left me, along with their small but profitable bakery in downtown Portland. David was 28, charming, and attentive in a way that felt like healing after months of grief. He was a real estate agent with big dreams and bigger debts, though I didn't learn about the debts until much later. He courted me with the intensity of a man who knew exactly what he wanted, and what he wanted, I now realize, was my money and my stability. The first red flag should have been how quickly he pushed for marriage. 6 months after we met, he was talking about our future, about combining our resources, about how much stronger we'd be as a team. "Your parents would want you to be happy," he'd say, his hand warm on mine. "They'd want you to have someone to take care of you." But I wasn't the only one who needed taking care of. David's family was a disaster wrapped in middle-class respectability. His mother, Eleanor, was a widow who'd spent the last 15 years since her husband's death making her son the center of her universe. She'd never worked a day in her life, living off her late husband's pension and David's increasingly strained attempts to support her lifestyle. His sister, Melissa, was a perpetual graduate student who changed majors every 2 years and had never held a job, funded entirely by David's guilt and Eleanor's manipulation. The second red flag was how they treated me during our engagement. I was never quite good enough, never quite what they'd envisioned for their golden boy. Eleanor would make comments about my common background, as if owning a successful bakery was somehow beneath her son, who couldn't make his rent without borrowing money. Melissa would forget to invite me to family gatherings, then act surprised when David showed up alone. But the biggest red flag was how David changed around them. The attentive, loving man who'd swept me off my feet would become distant and critical the moment we stepped into his mother's house. He'd find fault with my clothes, my conversation, my contributions to family discussions. It was as if he was performing his devotion to them by diminishing me, and I was too young and too lonely to recognize the pattern. The wedding was small and largely funded by my inheritance. Eleanor made sure everyone knew that David was marrying down, but that he was doing it out of love, as if I should be grateful for his sacrifice. My parents' friends came to support me, but I could see the concern in their eyes. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been my mother's best friend, pulled me aside after the ceremony. "Honey, are you sure about this?" she asked gently. "Your mother always said you were too trusting for your own good. This family, they feel like users to me." I should have listened. Instead, I smiled and assured her I was happy, that David loved me, that his family just needed time to warm up to me. Mrs. Patterson died of a heart attack 3 months later, and I lost the last connection to my parents and my past. The first year of marriage was a slow erosion disguised as compromise. David convinced me to sell my parents' house and use the proceeds as a down payment on a larger home in an upscale neighborhood, a house that would be more appropriate for his growing real estate business. When I hesitated about leaving the neighborhood where I'd grown up, he framed it as holding him back from his potential. "Emma, you have to think bigger than this," he'd say, gesturing dismissively at my parents' modest but beloved home. "I'm trying to build something here, and I need a wife who supports my ambitions, not someone who's stuck in the past." So I sold my childhood home and watched strangers move into the rooms where my parents had loved and laughed and built their life together. We bought the house in Laurelhurst, a beautiful craftsman-style home that David insisted needed extensive renovations to maximize its potential. I threw myself into the project, using more of my inheritance to fund upgrades that David promised would increase the property value. I should have paid more attention to the paperwork. I should have questioned why David handled all the legal aspects of the purchase, why he met with lawyers and contractors alone, why I was signing papers without reading every line. But I trusted him. More than that, I was exhausted from grief and eager to build something new, something that belonged to us together. The second year was worse. David's real estate business was struggling, and his solution was to borrow against the house, our house that I'd funded, to cover his expenses. When I questioned the wisdom of taking on more debt, he accused me of not believing in him, of being unsupportive, of holding him back with my small-minded concerns about money. Eleanor and Melissa were frequent visitors, always needing something. Eleanor's car would break down, and David would pay for repairs. Melissa would have a crisis with her landlord, and David would cover her rent. When I pointed out that we had our own expenses and goals, Eleanor would give me a cold smile. "Family takes care of family, Emma. I suppose you wouldn't understand, having no one left." It was a calculated cruelty designed to remind me of my isolation, and it worked. I had no parents to call for advice, no siblings to vent to, no family of my own to provide perspective on what was normal and what wasn't. David's family became my world by default, and they made sure that world was centered entirely around their needs. The final straw should have been when David transferred the house deed into Eleanor's name. He presented it as a smart financial move, a way to protect our assets from potential business liability. "It's just a formality," he assured me when I expressed concerns. "The house is still ours. Mom's just holding the title for legal protection. It's what successful people do, Emma. I thought you wanted me to be successful." I signed the papers because I loved him and because I didn't want to be the kind of wife who didn't trust her husband's judgment. I signed away my security, my inheritance, and my future because I believed in a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of funding for his dreams. By the third year, David barely pretended to include me in decisions that affected our life. He would make plans with his family and inform me afterward. He would spend money without discussing it with me first, then get angry if I questioned the purchases. He started staying out late, networking for his business, coming home smelling like perfume and making excuses that grew more elaborate and less believable over time. I started working longer hours at my bakery, partly because it was the one place that still felt like mine. and partly because I was afraid to go home to the tension and criticism that had replaced the love I thought we'd shared. My employees noticed the change in me, how I'd gone from cheerful and optimistic to withdrawn and anxious. But when they asked if everything was okay, I'd smile and deflect, too proud and too hopeful to admit that my marriage was falling apart. The beginning of the end came on a Thursday in March. David had been acting strangely for weeks, more secretive than usual, taking calls in private, being vague about his whereabouts. That morning, he'd left early for what he claimed was an important client meeting, but something about his demeanor felt off. Call it intuition or paranoia, but I decided to surprise him with lunch at his office. He wasn't there. His assistant, clearly uncomfortable, told me he'd been working from home that morning. When I called his cell, it went straight to voicemail. I drove home, my stomach tight with suspicion, and found his car in the driveway next to a red BMW I didn't recognize. I let myself in quietly, and the sounds coming from upstairs left no room for doubt. David was having an affair in our bedroom, the bedroom I'd decorated with furniture bought with my inheritance, in the house I'd funded with my parents' life insurance money. But instead of confronting them, I did something that surprised even me. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Some instinct told me I'd need evidence, that David would deny everything and make me question my own perceptions. I recorded the sounds, the voices, the unmistakable evidence of betrayal. Then I left the house as quietly as I'd entered and drove back to my bakery, where I sat in my office and cried until I had no tears left. That night, David came home acting perfectly normal, asking about my day, commenting on the dinner I'd managed to prepare, despite feeling like my world had collapsed. When I asked about his client meeting, he launched into an elaborate story about showing properties to a demanding buyer. He was so good at lying that if I hadn't heard the truth with my own ears, I might have believed him. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention in a way I never had before. I noticed how David would take calls in his car or wait until I was in the shower to respond to texts. I saw how he'd changed his routine, claiming new client meetings that always seemed to happen at convenient times for privacy. I watched him lie to my face night after night, and I began to understand that this wasn't a recent development. David had probably been unfaithful for much longer than I'd realized. The woman was Sarah Chen, a successful marketing executive who David had met through a mutual client. She was beautiful, accomplished, and most importantly, unencumbered by family expectations or financial dependence. She represented everything I wasn't: independent, career-focused, and wealthy in her own right. She didn't need David's family's approval or financial support. In many ways, she was everything I had been before I'd fallen in love and lost myself in the process. I might have been able to forgive the affair. People make mistakes, and marriages go through rough patches. And with counseling and genuine remorse, sometimes relationships can survive infidelity. But what I discovered next made forgiveness impossible. David wasn't just cheating on me. He was planning to leave me with nothing. I found the emails by accident when he left his laptop open, and I saw a notification from Sarah flash on the screen. Curiosity and suspicion got the better of me, and I opened his email account. The password was our anniversary date, which felt like a cruel irony. The emails painted a picture of calculated betrayal that took my breath away. David had been planning his exit strategy for months, maybe longer. He'd transferred the house into his mother's name not for asset protection, but to ensure I couldn't claim it in a divorce. He'd been slowly moving money from our joint accounts into accounts only he could access. He'd been consulting with a lawyer about how to minimize alimony payments and protect his assets from division. But the most devastating part was how he talked about me in those emails. I wasn't his wife, who deserved respect and consideration. I was an obstacle to be overcome, a problem to be solved. He called me financially naive and emotionally dependent, as if those were character flaws rather than the result of trusting the man I'd married. He joked about how easy it had been to get me to sign papers without reading them carefully, how my grief over my parents had made me malleable. "Emma won't see it coming," he'd written to Sarah. "She's too trusting and too isolated to fight back effectively. By the time she realizes what's happened, I'll already be free and clear with my assets protected. Mom thinks it's brilliant. She never liked Emma anyway, and she's excited to finally have me back." The emails revealed that Eleanor wasn't just a disapproving mother-in-law. She was an active participant in David's plan to divorce me and leave me homeless. She'd suggested the property transfer, helped him research divorce lawyers, and even offered to let him and Sarah live in her house after I was gone. Melissa was in on it too, joking about how they'd finally be rid of the bakery girl who'd never been good enough for their family. I printed everything. Every email, every text message I could access, every piece of evidence that showed the conspiracy against me. Then I sat in my kitchen, the kitchen I'd renovated with my own money, and planned my response. The first time I'd lived through this discovery, I'd confronted David immediately. I'd been emotional, accusatory, and ultimately ineffective. He'd denied everything, claimed I was paranoid and jealous, and somehow made me feel guilty for violating his privacy by reading his emails. Eleanor had supported his version of events, painting me as an unstable wife who was imagining problems that didn't exist. By the time I'd gotten my feet under me and hired a lawyer, David had already moved most of his assets beyond my reach and filed for divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences. The first time around, I'd lost everything. The house, most of our savings, even my bakery when I couldn't afford the legal fees to fight his attempts to claim part of my business as marital property. I'd ended up in a studio apartment working for someone else in a bakery I'd once owned, watching David and Sarah start their new life in the home I'd helped create. The car accident had been almost a relief. Driving home from another devastating meeting with my lawyer, crying too hard to see clearly, I'd run a red light and been hit by a semi-truck. The last thing I'd remembered was the sound of crushing metal and the thought that at least I wouldn't have to face another day of losing pieces of the life I'd built. But somehow, impossibly, I'd woken up in my bed 3 months ago with David beside me, snoring softly, completely unaware that I now knew exactly how this story was supposed to end. This time, I was ready to write a different ending. Present day. The decision to gather evidence systematically rather than confront David emotionally had been the first change I'd made. This time, I was methodical. I installed software on our shared computer that captured every keystroke, every email, every message. I bought a voice-activated recorder and hid it in our bedroom, capturing David's late-night phone calls with Sarah when he thought I was asleep. I documented every financial transaction, every secret meeting, every lie he told me about his whereabouts. But my secret weapon wasn't just evidence. It was knowledge of exactly how this betrayal was supposed to unfold. And, more importantly, knowledge of the one person who could stop it all with a single conversation. Eleanor Winters had many flaws, but dishonesty wasn't one of them. She was manipulative, controlling, and cold, but she had a rigid moral code when it came to marriage and family loyalty. She'd stayed with David's father through his gambling addiction and his affairs because she believed in the sanctity of marriage vows. She'd never remarried after his death because she believed widowhood was a sacred state. Most importantly, she despised infidelity with the passion of someone who'd lived through its devastation. The first time around, Eleanor had supported David's divorce because I'd had no proof of his affair, and she'd believed his story that I was unstable and paranoid. She'd seen me as a gold digger who'd used her son and was now trying to take him for everything he was worth. But this time, I wasn't going to let David control the narrative. This time, I was going to let Eleanor see exactly what kind of man her son had become. The plan required patience and perfect timing. I needed David to feel secure in his deception, confident that I suspected nothing and posed no threat to his exit strategy. So, I played the part of the oblivious wife, smiling when he lied about his whereabouts, accepting his excuses for working late, even being supportive when he claimed stress about his business was affecting our relationship. "I know you're under a lot of pressure," I'd say, rubbing his shoulders while he answered texts from Sarah right in front of me. "I'm here for you no matter what." He'd smile and kiss my forehead, all while planning my complete destruction. The irony was almost beautiful in its cruelty. I also made sure to be the perfect daughter-in-law during this period. I brought Eleanor her favorite pastries from the bakery, remembered her birthday with a thoughtful gift, even invited her over for dinner more frequently than usual. I wanted her to see me as the devoted wife and loving family member that I'd always tried to be, so that David's betrayal would sting even more sharply when she discovered the truth. Eleanor, despite her many faults, began to warm to me during those weeks in a way she never had before. Without David around to perform his criticism and distance for her approval, she started to see me as an individual rather than just an inadequate choice her son had made. We talked about her late husband, about her fears for David's future, about her pride in the family name and reputation. "You've been good for him, Emma," she'd told me one afternoon while we arranged flowers in her garden. "He's more stable now, more responsible. I may not have understood what he saw in you at first, but I can see how you've steadied him." I'd almost felt guilty about what I was planning. Almost. The trap I set was elegant in its simplicity. I knew that David and Sarah had been using our house for their afternoon meetings every Tuesday and Thursday when I was supposed to be at the bakery. I also knew that Eleanor had a standing appointment with her hairdresser every Tuesday at 2 p.m., which meant she'd be driving past our neighborhood at exactly the right time to witness what I needed her to see. On Tuesday, March 15th, exactly 3 months before my death in the other timeline, I called Eleanor and asked if she could stop by the house around 2:30 to pick up a book I'd borrowed from her. I made up a story about a bakery emergency that would prevent me from visiting her later as planned. She agreed, pleased that I was thinking of her despite my supposed crisis. Then I called my assistant manager and told her I'd be out for the afternoon with a family emergency. I parked my car at the coffee shop 3 blocks away and walked back to my house, letting myself in through the back door and positioning myself in the guest bedroom where I could see the street and hear everything that happened in our bedroom above. David and Sarah arrived at 1:45, right on schedule. They were so comfortable in their routine, so confident in their secrecy, that they didn't even bother to be particularly quiet. I could hear their laughter, their voices, the sounds of their passion in the bed I'd shared with David for 3 years. At exactly 2:28, I saw Eleanor's car pull into our driveway. I watched through the guest room window as she used her key, the key David had given her when we bought the house, supposedly for emergencies, and let herself in. The silence from upstairs was immediate and absolute. Then came Eleanor's voice, cold as winter and sharp as broken glass. "Get out of my house, both of you, right now." What followed was a masterclass in maternal fury. Eleanor didn't scream or cry or become hysterical. She simply stood in that doorway and destroyed her son with words that cut deeper than any blade. "34 years I carried you in my heart as the best thing I'd ever done with my life," she said, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. "34 years I defended you, supported you, believed you were a good man who would make his father proud. And this is what you've become? A cheater and a liar who betrays his wedding vows in the bed his wife bought with her parents' life insurance money?" I heard David trying to interrupt, trying to explain, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "Don't you dare say a word to me right now. Don't you dare try to justify this. That girl downstairs has bent over backward to make you happy, to support your dreams, to fit into a family that never made her feel welcome. She lost her parents, and instead of protecting her like a husband should, you've been planning to rob her blind and throw her away like garbage. Mom, you don't understand the whole situation. I understand enough. I understand that you put this house in my name so you could steal it from your wife. I understand that you've been planning this betrayal for months while letting her believe you loved her. I understand that you're exactly like your father, and I swore I'd never let you become him." The comparison to David's father, the gambling adulterer who'd put Eleanor through hell, was a devastating blow. David's worst fear had always been becoming like his dad, and Eleanor knew exactly where to aim her words for maximum damage. "You have 1 hour to get your things and get out," she continued. "Miss Chen, I suggest you leave now before I say something we'll both regret. And David, don't you dare show your face at my house or call my phone until you've figured out how to become the man I thought I'd raised." I heard rushed footsteps on the stairs, muffled arguments, the sounds of hasty packing. Through the window, I watched Sarah flee to her car and speed away, probably realizing that her affair with David had just become significantly more complicated now that his mother knew about it. David took longer to leave, and I could hear him pleading with Eleanor, trying to rebuild the bridges he'd just burned. But Eleanor was unmoved. When he finally carried his suitcases downstairs, she was waiting by the front door. "One more thing," she said as he reached for the handle. "This house belongs to Emma now. I'm transferring the deed back into her name where it should have been all along. And if you try to take 1 penny of her money or business in this divorce, I'll make sure everyone in this city knows exactly what kind of man you are. Your reputation, your career, your future. I'll destroy all of it to protect that girl from you." The front door slammed with a finality that echoed through the house. David was gone. Eleanor was furious. And I was finally free to stop pretending I didn't know exactly what had been happening in my marriage. I waited 5 minutes after David's car disappeared down the street before walking into the living room where Eleanor sat on the couch, her hands shaking with rage and disappointment. "How long have you known?" she asked without looking up. "About the affair, a few weeks. About the house and the financial planning. Long enough to realize I needed help from someone David would never expect to turn against him." Eleanor raised her eyes to meet mine, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw respect there. "You planned this. You knew I'd be here. Knew what I'd find. I needed you to see who he really was. David has always been able to manipulate the truth to make people doubt what they've seen with their own eyes. But you raised him. You know when he's lying, even if you've chosen to ignore it before." "I ignored too much," she said quietly. "I wanted so badly for him to be better than his father that I made excuses for behavior I should have confronted years ago. His selfishness, his entitlement, his willingness to use people who loved him. I saw it all and told myself it was ambition or drive or just immaturity he'd grow out of." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where her son had just driven away from the last family he'd ever have. "The house is yours," she said firmly. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork tomorrow. And Emma, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I never saw what he was doing to you, and I'm sorry I made it harder by never accepting you the way I should have. You don't need to apologize." "Yes, I do. You lost your parents, and instead of gaining a family, you got people who used your grief and loneliness against you. David learned his cruelty somewhere, and I'm afraid he learned it from watching me." We stood in silence for a moment, two women who'd both loved David in different ways and both been disappointed by who he'd chosen to become. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked. "Rebuild," I said simply. "Start over with the truth this time, instead of lies and false promises." Eleanor nodded. "If you need anything, references for a lawyer, someone to testify about David's character, anything at all, you call me. It's the least I can do." After she left, I walked through the house that was finally, legally, undeniably mine. Every room held memories of the life I'd tried to build with David, but also evidence of the woman I'd been before I'd lost myself in his manipulation and his family's disapproval. The kitchen where I'd tested bakery recipes and hosted dinner parties. The living room where I'd read books and planned menus and dreamed about children who would grow up in a home filled with love instead of criticism. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could breathe. David tried to call that evening and several times over the next few days. When I finally answered, his voice was a mixture of anger, desperation, and the wheedling tone he used when he wanted something from me. "Emma, we need to talk about this rationally. My mother was upset and she overreacted. This thing with Sarah, it's complicated, but it doesn't mean our marriage is over. We can work through this. Our marriage was over the moment you decided to steal my house and leave me homeless," I replied calmly. "I've already filed for divorce, David. I've also documented every penny you've taken from our joint accounts and every asset you've tried to hide. You're going to return all of it, plus pay me back for every dollar of my inheritance you spent on your business and your family. You can't prove any of that. It's your word against mine." "Actually, I can prove all of it. I have recordings, emails, bank records, everything. Your conversations with Sarah, where you laughed about how easy it was to manipulate me. Your discussions with Eleanor about the property transfer. Your meetings with lawyers about how to minimize what I'd get in the divorce. I have it all, David." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. "Even if you do have some evidence, fighting me will cost you more in legal fees than you'll win. You know I can drag this out for years." "With what money?" I asked sweetly. "Your mother cut you off, remember? And Sarah's not going to fund a legal battle against the wife you lied to her about. She's already moved on, by the way. Apparently, she has higher standards than I gave her credit for." That last part was a guess, but David's sharp intake of breath told me I'd hit close to home. "You've changed, Emma. This isn't like you." "You're right. The old Emma would have trusted you when you said it was all a misunderstanding. The old Emma would have believed your promises and given you another chance to hurt her. but that Emma died in a car accident 3 months from now, alone and broke, because she was too trusting to protect herself from the man who was supposed to love her. David was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. What are you talking about? What car accident? Nothing you need to worry about. Just sign the divorce papers, David. Take responsibility for what you've done and move on with your life. It's the closest thing to dignity you're going to get out of this situation. I hung up and blocked his number. Within a week, his lawyer had contacted mine with a settlement offer that returned every penny he'd stolen and covered all my legal fees. And David might have been a liar and a cheat, but he wasn't stupid. He knew when he was beaten. 6 months later, the bakery was thriving in ways it never had when I was distracted by trying to save my marriage. I'd hired 3 new employees, expanded our catering services, and opened a small cafe section that had become a popular lunch spot for the downtown business crowd. The insurance settlement from selling the house back to myself, a legal quirk that had made my lawyer chuckle, had given me the capital to finally pursue all the dreams I'd put on hold to support David's ambitions. Eleanor and I had developed an unlikely friendship. She'd enrolled in a community college course on small business management and had started helping me with the administrative side of the bakery expansion. It turned out she had a sharp mind for numbers and organization when she wasn't channeling all her energy into managing her adult children's lives. I spent so many years making David the center of my world that I forgot I was supposed to have a world of my own, she'd told me one afternoon while we reviewed vendor contracts. Maybe if I'd been a more complete person, I wouldn't have raised such a selfish son. Melissa had tried to maintain a relationship with both Eleanor and me after David's exile, but her attempts to play both sides had quickly become exhausting. When she'd suggested that maybe we were all being too hard on David and that families should forgive each other, Eleanor had given her a look that could have frozen water. Your brother stole from his wife and cheated on her in the bed she bought with her dead parents' money, Eleanor had said quietly. If you think that's forgivable behavior, then I raised 2 disappointments instead of just 1. Melissa had stormed out and hadn't spoken to either of us since, which Eleanor considered a blessing in disguise. David had moved to Seattle with a different woman. Apparently, Sarah had indeed moved on quickly once the excitement of the affair had been replaced by the messy reality of dating a man whose own mother wouldn't speak to him. His real estate license had been suspended after several of his former clients had come forward with complaints about misrepresented properties and hidden fees. The last I'd heard, he was working as a used car salesman and living in a studio apartment, a far cry from the successful lifestyle he'd been planning to fund with my inheritance. The divorce had been finalized 4 months ago, and the relief I'd felt when I'd signed those papers had been indescribable. I was free, truly free, for the first time in years. Free to make decisions based on my own desires instead of someone else's expectations. Free to trust my instincts instead of second-guessing myself at every turn. Free to build a life that belonged entirely to me. I'd started dating again, cautiously and on my own terms. There was a man named James who came into the bakery every Tuesday for coffee and had finally worked up the courage to ask me to dinner. He was kind, funny, and most importantly, seemed genuinely interested in who I was as a person, rather than what I could do for him. We'd been on 3 dates, and while it was too early to know if it would develop into something serious, I was enjoying the experience of getting to know someone without the pressure of needing them to complete me. The most surprising change had been in my relationship with myself. The woman who'd been so desperate for David's approval, so willing to minimize her own needs to keep peace in the family, had been replaced by someone who knew her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. I'd started therapy to work through the trauma of the emotional abuse I'd endured, and I'd learned to recognize the manipulation tactics that had once controlled my life. The nightmares about the car accident had stopped after the divorce was final. I still remembered that other timeline vividly, the despair, the financial ruin, the crushing loneliness of realizing that the man I'd loved had never really existed. But those memories served as a reminder now rather than a source of pain. They were proof of what I'd overcome and motivation to never again let anyone treat me as less than I was worth. On quiet evenings in my house legally and completely mine, I would sometimes think about the cosmic joke that had given me a second chance at this life. I didn't pretend to understand how or why I'd been allowed to come back and rewrite my story. Maybe it was some kind of supernatural intervention. Maybe it was just an incredibly vivid dream that had taught me to value myself properly. Or maybe the universe occasionally decides that justice needs a helping hand. Whatever the explanation, I was grateful. Not just for the chance to escape David's betrayal with my dignity and finances intact, but for the opportunity to discover who I really was when I wasn't constantly trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. The girl who'd married David at 24 had been lost and grieving and desperate to belong somewhere. The woman who divorced him at 27 was strong, successful, and complete in herself. She'd learned that love shouldn't require you to disappear, that marriage shouldn't be a slow erosion of your identity, and that the right person will celebrate your strength rather than try to diminish it. I kept a photo on my desk at the bakery, not of David or our wedding or any remnant of that failed marriage, but of my parents on their wedding day. They were looking at each other with such joy and respect and genuine partnership that it took my breath away every time I saw it. That was the standard I was holding myself to now. Love that built you up instead of tearing you down. Love that saw you clearly and cherished what it saw. Love that made you more yourself rather than less. David had texted me once, about 2 months after the divorce was final. Just 3 words. "I'm sorry, Emma." I'd stared at those words for a long time, feeling nothing but a mild sadness for the man who'd been so afraid of not being enough, that he'd tried to make everyone around him feel smaller. Then I deleted the message without responding and blocked his new number. Some apologies come too late to matter, and some people have to learn to live with the consequences of their choices. David had chosen to lie, cheat, and steal from the person who'd loved him most. Now he got to live with being the kind of man his own mother couldn't respect and his own conscience couldn't defend. I had chosen differently. I had chosen to fight back, to demand better, to refuse to be anyone's victim. And now I got to live with being the kind of woman who knew her own worth and wouldn't settle for anything less than she deserved. It was, without question, the better choice. The bakery's afternoon rush was winding down when Eleanor stopped by with the final paperwork from her lawyer. The house was officially, completely, irreversibly mine, with no legal connection to David or his debts remaining. "How does it feel?" she asked, watching me sign the last document. "Like coming home to myself," I replied, and realized it was the truest thing I'd said in years. Eleanor smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen on her face since the day she'd discovered who her son really was. "Your parents would be proud of you," she said quietly. "You've built something beautiful here, something that's entirely your own." I looked around the bustling cafe at the employees I'd hired and mentored, at the business I'd grown through my own hard work and determination, at the life I'd built from the ashes of betrayal and heartbreak. She was right. My parents would be proud, not just of the business success, but of the woman I'd become. Someone who could face the worst betrayal imaginable and emerge stronger, kinder, and more complete than before. The bell above the door chimed as James walked in for his usual Tuesday coffee, his face lighting up when he saw me behind the counter. He'd brought me daisies again, simple, cheerful flowers that reminded me of spring and new beginnings. Not expensive roses designed to impress, just a small gesture that said he'd been thinking of me. "Ready for dinner on Friday?" he asked, his nervousness still endearing after 3 dates. "I'm looking forward to it," I replied, and meant it completely. As I handed him his coffee and accepted his flowers, I caught my reflection in the window behind him. The woman looking back at me was confident, content, and completely at peace with the life she'd fought to create. She'd been tested by betrayal and manipulation, and she'd emerged victorious not through revenge or bitterness, but through the simple act of refusing to accept less than she deserved. That night, alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea and the satisfaction of a day well lived, I raised a toast to the woman I'd been. Naive and trusting and ultimately too good for the people who'd tried to use her, and to the woman I'd become, wise, strong, and finally, completely free. The second chance I'd been given hadn't just saved me from financial ruin and emotional devastation. It had saved me from a lifetime of not knowing my own worth, of accepting crumbs when I deserved the whole feast, of believing that love meant making yourself smaller, to fit someone else's vision of who you should be? David had taught me what I wouldn't tolerate. Eleanor had taught me that it's never too late to choose dignity over denial. My parents, through their example and their love, had taught me what real partnership looked like. But I had taught myself the most important lesson of all, that I was worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth celebrating exactly as I was. And that knowledge, hard won and battle tested, was worth more than any house, any marriage, or any second chance the universe could offer. It was worth everything.